May 14th, 1940. The Rotterdam Central Library. Smoke choked the spring air as librarian Hendrika van der Meer watched flames consume the city outside her window. The German bombers had done their work with terrifying efficiency. Now, standing among the wooden shelves heavy with centuries of Dutch knowledge, she faced a choice that would define the next 5 years of her life. The Wehrmacht soldiers would arrive within hours. With them would come orders, lists, demands. Books would be seized, burned, banned. Ideas would be classified as dangerous. Knowledge itself would become contraband. Hendrika made her decision before the last bomber disappeared beyond the horizon. If words could be weapons, then librarians would become soldiers. If books could be banned, then they would be hidden. If knowledge was dangerous to tyrants, then it would be preserved at any cost. She didn't know it yet, but across the Netherlands, dozens of her colleagues were making the same choice. They would transform quiet reading rooms into battlegrounds. Card catalogs would become codes. Children's story hours would hide resistance meetings. And the Dewey Decimal System would be weaponized against the Third Reich. This is the story of how civilian librarians became unlikely warriors, how banned books were smuggled in baby carriages and hidden behind Shakespeare, how maps tracking Allied advances were concealed inside fairy tale collections, and how the simple act of lending a book became an act of treason, punishable by death. The Dutch called them boekenbewaarders, the bookkeepers. The Germans called them enemies of the state. History would call them heroes. The invasion began not with tanks, but with lists. Within weeks of the Netherlands' surrender on May 15, 1940, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the newly appointed Reich Commissioner, issued his first cultural directive. It arrived at libraries across the nation on June 3, 1940, typed on official German stationery with the characteristic precision that would mark 5 years of occupation. All materials deemed harmful to German-Dutch relations or the advancement of National Socialist principles must be removed from public access immediately. Attached was the first Lijst verboden publications, the list of forbidden publications. It contained 187 titles. At the Leiden University Library, head librarian Dr. Willem Mengelberg stared at the list with growing horror. Karl Marx's Das Kapital, Stefan Zweig's biography of Erasmus, works by Thomas Mann, Heinrich Heine, Sigmund Freud, Jewish authors, communist authors, democratic authors, authors whose only crime was thinking differently than the Reich. More distressing was the category marked degenerate literature, which included virtually every major Dutch writer of the previous century who had championed democracy, criticized authoritarianism, or simply celebrated Dutch independence. At the bottom of the list was a sentence that chilled every librarian who read it. This list will be updated monthly. Compliance is mandatory. Failure to remove forbidden materials will result in immediate closure of the facility and arrest of responsible personnel. Mengelberg called an emergency meeting of the library's senior staff that evening. Present were 8 librarians, 2 archivists, and a cataloger named Anna Voss, who would later become legendary in Dutch resistance circles. "They want us to burn books," Mengelberg said quietly. "Just like Berlin in '33, they're asking us to become accomplices in the murder of ideas." The youngest librarian present, 24-year-old Peter Janssen, spoke up. "Then we refuse. We hide them." "Hide where?" another asked. "They'll search the building. They'll inventory everything." Anna Voss leaned forward, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "They'll inventory what we show them. They don't know what we have. Our catalog system is complicated, easy to make mistakes, easy to misplace things. A slow smile spread across Mengelberg's face. The catalog is a mess, isn't it? So many filing errors, books misshelved, duplicates accidentally created, terrible record keeping. Terrible, Anna agreed. It would take years to sort out properly. The decision was made. They would comply publicly while resisting privately. Books would disappear from shelves, but not from existence. Catalog cards would be accidentally misfiled. Records would become mysteriously confused, and the forbidden knowledge would flow underground, hidden but not destroyed. They had no idea they were part of a movement. Across the Netherlands, in cities and towns, university libraries and public reading rooms, librarians were making the same choice. The resistance was being born in whispers among the stacks.
The Amsterdam Public Library occupied a grand building on the Prinsengracht, 3 stories of neo-Renaissance architecture filled with over 200,000 volumes. Its head librarian, Margaretha Griep-Bakker, was a formidable woman of 52 who had spent 30 years mastering the art of library science. Now, she would apply that expertise to deception. When the German cultural officers arrived for their first inspection in July 1940, Griet met them with perfect professional courtesy. She showed them the card catalog, explained the classification system, walked them through the reading rooms. She was the image of cooperation. What they didn't see was the storage room she'd converted into a hidden archive. What they didn't know was that every removed book on their list had been carefully recorded, wrapped in oilcloth, and hidden in locations throughout the building. False walls behind bookshelves, hollow spaces beneath floorboards, the gap between the ceiling and the roof in the old section where renovations had created a perfect hiding spot. But Griet's most brilliant innovation was simpler. She kept the forbidden books in plain sight. The trick was camouflage. A forbidden book by Heinrich Mann would be removed from its original dust jacket and placed in the jacket of an approved German romance novel. The catalog card would be filed under the acceptable title, but with a tiny pencil mark in the upper right corner, invisible unless you knew to look for it. The spine would be relabeled using reversible techniques known only to professional bookbinders. To any German inspector, the shelf held harmless literature. To a Dutch reader who knew the code, it was a treasure trove of forbidden knowledge. We became experts in double meanings, Griet would later recall in her 1947 memoir, De Verborgen Bibliothek, The Hidden Library. Every book had 2 identities. Every catalog card told 2 truths. We created a shadow library that existed simultaneously with the official one. The Germans could see our shelves, but not read our secrets. The system worked because it relied on something the occupiers never understood: the relationship between librarians and their regular patrons. The elderly professor who had been checking out philosophy texts every Tuesday for 20 years. The student who came every Thursday afternoon for history books. The housewife who loved Dutch poetry. These people received discreet notifications, a whisper at the checkout desk, a slip of paper tucked into a returned book. If you're looking for Menno ter Braak's essays, ask for Die Deutsche Frau im Haus, section 834. Don't use the title at the desk, just the number. The patron would understand. They would find the German domestic manual on the shelf, open it, and discover ter Braak's forbidden essays on democracy and freedom. They would check it out using the false title, read it at home, and return it quietly. The Germans never suspected. To them, librarians were harmless bureaucrats managing dusty shelves. They couldn't imagine that every smile, every stamped card, every filed catalog entry was an act of calculated resistance. By autumn 1940, the scattered acts of defiance were connecting into a network. Librarians discovered each other through careful conversations at professional conferences that the Germans still allowed. A shared glance at the mention of a forbidden author, a coded comment about misfiled cards, a suggestion to compare cataloging systems. The real organization began in November 1940, when Anna Voss from Leiden traveled to Amsterdam to meet with Griet Bakker. They met in a cafe near the library, two middle-aged women drinking ersatz coffee and discussing what appeared to be library administration. "We've hidden over 800 volumes," Anna said quietly, stirring her coffee. But hiding isn't enough. The underground newspapers need information. The BBC broadcasts names and events, but people need context. They need maps, histories, political analysis. They need to understand what's happening. Griet nodded slowly. "You're talking about becoming distributors. That's different from preservation. That's active resistance." "Yes, people have been executed for less." "I know." Griet was silent for a long moment. "We'd need couriers. We can't use the post. Everything's monitored. We'd need people who can move materials without suspicion." "Who moves through cities unnoticed?" Anna asked. They looked at each other and spoke simultaneously. "Children." The idea was brilliant and terrible. Children could go anywhere. Children playing in the streets, running errands, visiting friends. No German soldier would stop a 10-year-old girl carrying a picture book. No inspector would search a boy's school bag for hidden pamphlets. But using children meant putting them in danger. The resistance networks had been debating this very question for months. How young was too young? What risks were acceptable? Anna had an answer. "We use our own children, librarians' children. We train them. We make sure they understand the risks, but we give them agency. They choose to help. And if they're caught, then we pay the price," Anna said grimly. "But isn't that better than teaching them that evil should be accommodated, that knowledge should be surrendered, that their parents were cowards who stood by while tyranny burned books?" Griet made her decision. "I have two daughters, 14 and 12. I'll ask them. No pressure, but I'll ask." Within a month, the Children's Network was operating. Not many, perhaps 30 children across 5 cities initially, all children of librarians and trusted patrons. They were trained carefully, how to act natural, how to handle questions, how to destroy materials if capture seemed imminent. The packages they carried looked innocent. A child's storybook might have underground newspaper pages folded between its covers. A school textbook might contain maps showing Allied positions. A picture book about Dutch windmills might hide photographs of German installations taken by resistance photographers. The children became experts at their craft. They developed signals, safe houses, emergency protocols. If stopped, they had rehearsed stories. The book was for their grandmother. The papers were for school. They were innocent, confused, apologetic, and they always led pursuers away from the library. The network called them Die kleine Kuriers, the little couriers. Between November 1940 and May 1945, these children would move tens of thousands of documents, maps, newspapers, and books through occupied Netherlands without a single capture resulting in a library raid.
As 1941 progressed, the techniques became more sophisticated. The Germans updated their forbidden list monthly, adding dozens of titles each time. By December 1941, over 3,000 books were officially banned. By 1943, the number exceeded 12,000. Hiding that many volumes required industrial-scale deception. At the Rotterdam Library, rebuilt after the bombing in temporary quarters, librarian Johan Dekker developed the scatter system. Instead of creating single large hiding places, he distributed banned books throughout the entire collection, hidden behind rows of approved German literature, agricultural manuals, and technical texts that inspectors rarely examined. "You can't find what you're not looking for," Dekker explained to other librarians at a covert meeting in March 1942. They search for specific titles, but if Das Kapital is behind 10 copies of German engine repair manuals in the technical section, who will find it? They'd have to pull every book in the building, and we have 80,000 volumes. In The Hague, librarian Saskia de Vries perfected the art of the false catalog. She maintained 2 complete card catalogs, identical in every visible way. The official catalog showed only approved books. The secret catalog, kept in a locked storage room and disguised as damaged cards awaiting repair, contained the real collection. Trusted patrons were given a key to the storage room. They could access the secret catalog when the library was quiet, note the real location of banned books, and check them out using a separate circulation system that existed entirely off the official records. "We became a black market for knowledge," Saskia recalled. "But unlike black marketeers, we charge nothing. Knowledge should be free, especially dangerous knowledge." The most elaborate scheme emerged in Utrecht, where university librarians discovered a wine cellar beneath the library that dated to the 17th century. Sealed in the 1890s during renovations, it had been forgotten by everyone except the oldest maintenance worker who mentioned it casually one day. Within a week, librarians had reopened the cellar, installed proper shelving, and created a complete underground library of forbidden materials. Access was through a loose floorboard in a janitor's closet. Over 5,000 volumes were stored there, including the library's entire collection of Jewish authors, political philosophy, and anti-authoritarian literature. The cellar became more than storage. It became a reading room. Trusted students and faculty would be quietly invited to special seminars held in evening hours. They would descend through the floorboard into a candle-lit vault where banned books lined the walls and discussions that could mean death happened freely. Professor Ernst van Dyck, who attended these sessions throughout the war, described them in his 1949 memoir. "In that cellar, democracy survived. We read Voltaire and Locke by candlelight while Nazi soldiers patrolled the streets above our heads. We debated freedom while living in chains. Those sessions kept our minds free when everything else was imprisoned. The librarians gave us something more valuable than books. They gave us proof that ideas cannot be conquered by force." By 1942, the library network had evolved beyond preservation into active intelligence distribution. The underground newspapers, De Waarheid, Trouw, Vrij Nederland, Het Parool, desperately needed context and historical information for their articles. The BBC's Radio Oranje broadcasts from London provided current news, but listeners needed maps to understand troop movements, historical knowledge to contextualize events, and technical information to understand military developments. The librarians became research specialists for the resistance. A typical request would come through a courier, often a child, sometimes a trusted merchant. A folded slip of paper with a question. Need maps showing rail lines from Germany to Poland, pre-war technical specifications if possible. The librarians would immediately understand. The resistance needed to know deportation routes. They would pull railroad atlases from the engineering section, geography texts from the reference collection, pre-war German technical manuals from the foreign language section. They would create handwritten summaries of key information, attach hand-drawn maps copied from official sources, and send everything back through the courier network. Or the request might be historical analysis of German military performance in winter conditions, Russia 1812, France 1870, any relevant sources. After the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, such requests became common. The resistance wanted to understand German vulnerabilities, to give hope to the occupied population, to inform BBC broadcasts. Librarians would compile research from military history texts, weather data from meteorology references, and analysis from pre-war military journals. The information packages were always disguised. A research summary on winter warfare might be copied on the blank pages of a damaged children's book, the text hidden between illustrations of fairy tales. Maps would be folded into the end pages of seemingly innocent novels. Technical specifications would be written in tiny script in the margins of agricultural manuals. Anna Voss became the network's coordinator. From her position at Leiden University Library, she maintained contact with 17 libraries across the Netherlands. She received information requests, distributed them to specialists, compiled the research, and coordinated distribution through the courier network. Her system was sophisticated. Each library had a specialization based on its collection strengths. Rotterdam handled military and engineering questions. Amsterdam covered political theory and current events analysis. The Hague focused on international law and diplomatic history. Leiden managed scientific and medical information. When a request came in, Anna would route it to the appropriate specialist, set a deadline, and arrange courier pickup. The research would be compiled, disguised, and distributed, often within 48 hours. The volume was staggering. Anna's personal log, recovered after the war, shows that between January 1942 and April 1945, the library network processed over 2,800 requests from resistance organizations. They produced thousands of maps, hundreds of technical analyses, and compiled research on everything from explosives manufacturing to forgery techniques to medical care for wounded resistance fighters. They were, in essence, running a research service for the resistance, and every piece of information they provided was an act of treason against the Reich.
The Germans were not stupid. By mid-1942, the Sicherheitsdienst, the security service of the SS, had noticed patterns. Underground newspapers contained detailed historical analysis and precise technical information that suggested access to research libraries. Maps appeared that matched pre-war atlases too closely to be memory or guesswork. SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Richter was assigned to investigate. A former university lecturer in library science, he understood how libraries functioned. More dangerously, he understood how they could be subverted. Richter began with inspections, unannounced visits to libraries across the Netherlands, demanding to see catalogs, inventories, checkout records. He looked for gaps, inconsistencies, evidence of hidden collections. The librarians had prepared for this. Their record-keeping was intentionally chaotic, but in ways that appeared to be bureaucratic incompetence rather than deliberate sabotage. Cards were misfiled in complex but plausible patterns. Inventory records contained transcription errors that were individually minor but collectively obscured the truth. Checkout systems were maintained in ways that made tracking individual borrowers nearly impossible without weeks of analysis. Richter grew frustrated. He knew something was wrong but couldn't prove it. The librarians were too skilled, too careful. Then, in October 1942, he caught a break. A child courier, 10-year-old Piet van Houten, was stopped by a Wehrmacht patrol near the Amsterdam Central Station. In his school bag was a picture book about Dutch sailing ships. A bored soldier flipped through it and noticed that the end papers seemed too thick. Peeling them apart, he found maps. Detailed maps showing German defensive positions along the Dutch coast. Pete was arrested. Under interrogation at SD headquarters, the boy stuck to his story. He found the book on a bench. He was taking it to his grandmother, who loved ships. He didn't know about any maps. They didn't believe him. For 3 days they questioned the child, using increasingly harsh methods. Pete never broke. He gave them nothing. On the 4th day, Richter tried a different approach. He showed Pete photographs of libraries. Have you been to any of these places? To return books? To visit? Pete stared at the photographs. He recognized the Amsterdam Public Library, Griet Bakker's library. But he shook his head. I don't go to libraries. Books are boring. Richter wasn't fooled. He ordered surveillance on every major library in Amsterdam. For 6 weeks, SD agents photographed everyone entering and leaving. They noted patterns, identified regular visitors, tracked children. The library network realized the danger. Griet sent urgent warnings through the network. Suspend all operations. SD is watching. Tell the children to stay away. For 2 months, the system went dark. No information packages moved. No banned books circulated. The libraries became exactly what they appeared to be. Quiet institutions following German regulations. But the underground newspapers desperately needed information. The Battle of Stalingrad was raging. People wanted to understand what was happening. The resistance needed analysis, context, hope. In December 1942, Anna Voss made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She resumed operations, but with extreme precautions. Only the most trusted couriers, only the most critical information, and never, ever through monitored libraries. The packages would be handed off in markets, churches, parks. Librarians would leave their institutions, meet couriers in public spaces, pass materials in moments of crowded anonymity. It was riskier, but it worked. For a while.
March 8th, 1943, Leiden. Anna Voss kissed her husband goodbye at breakfast, walked to the library as she had done for 15 years, and began her workday cataloging new acquisitions. At 10:15 a.m., SD agents entered the library. Richter himself led the team. They had a warrant and a list of charges. Anna saw them coming. She had time for one thought. They finally found us. But Richter walked past her desk. His target was downstairs, in the archive section, where Jan Mulder, a 68-year-old archivist and Anna's closest colleague in the resistance work, was carefully wrapping a package of maps for a courier pickup. The arrest was violent. Jan fought back, trying to destroy the maps, but there were 4 agents. They beat him to the floor, handcuffed him, and dragged him out through the main reading room as staff and patrons watched in horror. Richter paused at Anna's desk. "You're his supervisor." "Yes." "Yes." "You knew nothing of his activities?" "I know he's a faithful employee who has served this library for 40 years. Richter smiled coldly. "He's a traitor who will hang. If I find evidence that you knew about his activities, you'll hang beside him." The investigation that followed was terrifying. For 3 weeks, SD agents went through every record, every catalog card, every checkout slip in the Leiden library. They interviewed every staff member multiple times.
They searched Jan's home and brought in his wife for questioning. But they found nothing conclusive. Jan had been extraordinarily careful. The maps in his possession were copies of public documents. He claimed he was compiling them for an academic project on Dutch cartography, approved by the German Cultural Ministry. He had forged documentation supporting this story, complete with official stamps and signatures. The SD knew it was fake, but they couldn't prove it. German bureaucracy required documentation. Jan had documentation. The fact that it was sophisticated forgery work didn't matter unless they could prove it was forged. After 3 weeks, they released him with a warning. But the interrogation had been brutal. Jan returned to work with broken ribs, damaged hearing from repeated beatings, and a haunted look in his eyes. "They know," he told Anna quietly. "They know we're doing something. They just can't prove it yet. We need to stop. If we stop, we let them win. If we continue, we'll all be arrested. Then we'll be arrested for something that matters." Jan stared at Anna's colleague for a long moment. "You've become a fanatic." "No," Anna said softly. "I've become committed. There's a difference. Fanatics believe in causes. I believe in knowledge, in truth, in the idea that information should be free. The Germans want to control what people know, what they think, what they believe. As long as we can provide access to forbidden knowledge, they haven't won. The moment we stop, we concede that their power over books is absolute. I won't concede that." Jan returned to work. So did Anna. The network continued operating, though more carefully than ever. But the incident had consequences. Other librarians hearing about Leiden grew fearful. Some withdrew from the network. Some asked to be given less dangerous roles. The system contracted. The SD pressure was having its intended effect.
The close call at Leiden forced a reckoning about the children's role. In April 1943, representatives from 7 libraries met secretly in a farmhouse outside Utrecht. The debate was passionate. "We're putting children at risk," argued Peter Janssen from Rotterdam. "Piet van Houten was tortured by the SD. He was 10 years old. How can we justify that?" "Piet chose to participate," countered Grietbacher. "We explained the risks to him and his parents. He understood and volunteered. We can't take away his agency just because he's young. He's a child. Children can't meaningfully consent to being tortured." "Then what's the alternative?" Griet demanded. "Adult couriers are watched more closely. They're more likely to be searched. Using children is safer, not more dangerous, because the Germans don't take them seriously." "Until they do, and then the children pay the price." The argument went in circles for hours. Finally, Anna Vos proposed a compromise. "We ask the children, all of them. We gather them together, explain that the danger has increased, tell them honestly what the risks are, and we let them decide whether to continue. No pressure, no judgment if they want to stop. They choose." The meeting that followed was extraordinary. 23 children, ages 8 to 16, gathered in the same farmhouse 2 weeks later. Their parents were present. The librarians explained the situation honestly. The SD was hunting for couriers. Children had been arrested. The work was becoming more dangerous. "If you want to stop, no one will think less of you. You've already done more than anyone could expect. You've been heroes. If you want to go back to being children, that's perfectly reasonable." There was a long silence. Then 14-year-old Sophie Bacher, Griet's daughter, stood up. "My grandmother told me about the Spanish Inquisition. about how people were tortured for reading forbidden books, about how knowledge was treated as heresy. She said that period was the darkest time in history because people accepted that authority should control what they're allowed to know. She said it took centuries to recover from that. If we stop now, we're accepting the same thing. We're saying the Nazis have the right to decide what Dutch people can know. I won't accept that. I'll continue. One by one, the other children stood up. Some were crying, some looked terrified, but all of them stood. Every single child voted to continue. Their parents were given the final decision. 21 of 23 sets of parents agreed to let their children keep working. 2 families withdrew, which everyone respected, but the network continued with its youngest members fully committed. The children would later say that decision shaped their entire lives. They had been asked to make a choice about resistance, about courage, about whether knowledge was worth fighting for. And they had chosen yes.
By late 1943, the library network had achieved a level of sophistication that bordered on artistry. The techniques they developed would be studied after the war as examples of how institutional resistance could function under totalitarian control. In Amsterdam, Griet Bakker had perfected what she called the triple blind. A banned book would be hidden inside an approved book's dust jacket, first layer. That book would be shelved in a section that appeared to contain only technical manuals, second layer. The catalog card would be filed under a completely different title, using a code only network members understood, third layer. To access the book, a patron would need to 1. Know the code system existed. 2. Know how to find the coded catalog card. 3. Know how to identify the right book on the shelf. 4. Know how to remove the dust jacket without damaging it to reveal the real book inside. German inspectors could search every shelf, read every catalog card, and check every record without ever discovering the hidden collection, because they didn't know the system existed. In Rotterdam, Johan Dekker developed circulation laundering. Banned books would be checked out under false names using forged library cards. They would be circulated through the resistance network for weeks or months. When returned, they would be checked in under different false names, creating circulation records that made the books appear popular while making it impossible to track actual readers. We created phantom patrons, Johan explained in his post-war testimony. Hundreds of people who existed in our records, but not in reality. They checked out acceptable books and forbidden books with equal frequency. If the SD analyzed our records, they'd see normal circulation patterns. They'd never identify the real resistance members among all the ghosts. The most audacious scheme emerged in The Hague, where Saskia de Vries realized that the Germans trusted their own documentation more than their eyes. She obtained blank official forms from the German Cultural Ministry, forged approval stamps, and created fake authorization documents for a research project on Dutch literature. The fake documents authorized her library to maintain a special collection of materials under investigation that would be removed from public circulation, but preserved for cultural analysis. This gave her a legitimate excuse to have banned books in the building. The Germans had authorized her to keep exactly what they wanted to destroy. And they never noticed because the paperwork was correct.
By 1944, the library network had become crucial to broader resistance operations. The information they provided went far beyond banned books. They were supplying intelligence that shaped military operations. The most significant contribution came in March 1944, when resistance groups were planning sabotage operations against rail lines used to transport V-2 rockets from German factories to launch sites in the Netherlands. The operation required precise knowledge of rail infrastructure, scheduling, and security procedures. The Leiden Library's engineering section contained pre-war German railway technical manuals. The Rotterdam Library had transit schedules from 1939. The Amsterdam Library had maps showing every rail junction in the eastern Netherlands. The Utrecht Archives had security procedures for rail transport of military materials captured from a German administrative office in 1942. Anna Voss coordinated the research. Within 3 days, the network had compiled a comprehensive intelligence package, maps showing vulnerable points, schedules indicating when V-2 transports moved through each junction, technical specifications for the rail line, and security procedures the Germans would follow. The package was passed to the resistance, who shared it with British SOE agents. The resulting sabotage operation, coordinated between Dutch resistance and British special forces, destroyed 3 V-2 transports and severely disrupted the rocket program. British intelligence later called the library research the most detailed pre-operation intelligence package we received from any occupied territory. The SOE officer who received it wrote in his report, "The level of detail suggests access to German planning documents. We could not have compiled this intelligence without months of surveillance. The Dutch provided it in 72 hours." What the British didn't realize was that the intelligence came entirely from public sources, pre-war technical manuals, transit schedules, archived maps, combined by skilled researchers who understood how to extract military significance from seemingly innocent information. This became the library network's greatest strength. They weren't stealing German secrets. They were demonstrating that knowledge freely available before the occupation, combined with skilled analysis, was sufficient to undermine German operations. The Germans never caught on. They increased security on classified documents while never realizing that their real vulnerability was the knowledge their enemies already possessed and were clever enough to apply.
The winter of 1944-45 brought the Netherlands to the edge of destruction. After the failure of Operation Market Garden in September 1944, the Germans imposed a transportation embargo on the still occupied Western Netherlands in retaliation for a railway strike. Food couldn't reach cities. Coal couldn't be delivered. Over 4.5 million Dutch civilians faced starvation. The libraries continued operating, though barely. There was no heat. The electricity worked only a few hours a day. Staff members were themselves starving, living on tulip bulbs and sugar beets when they could find them. But the information work continued. Now the request changed. Medical information on treating starvation, survival techniques, edible plants, water purification. The librarians, themselves weakened by hunger, compiled survival guides, medical texts on nutrition, biology books identifying wild plants, chemistry references on water safety. They hand-wrote summaries, copied key passages, drew diagrams showing which plants were safe. These guides circulated through the resistance network into communities on the edge of survival.
The information was basic, but it saved lives. Knowing which tree bark was edible, how to recognize clean water, signs of severe malnutrition requiring immediate medical attention. Grit Backer collapsed at her desk in January 1945, unconscious from hunger. She recovered after 3 days in bed, sustained by a small emergency ration her daughters had saved for her. The day after she recovered, she returned to the library and resumed compiling survival information. People needed knowledge more than ever, she explained. Information was the one resource we still had. We couldn't give them food, but we could teach them how to survive with less. That was worth getting up for. The underground newspapers during this period published survival guides that were almost entirely researched by the library network. Articles on identifying edible plants, treating malnutrition, and preserving what little food existed were based on information compiled by librarians working while themselves starving. Anna Voss lost 45 pounds that winter. Johann Decker's wife died of starvation-related illness. Saskia de Vries's father froze to death when fuel ran out. But the librarians kept working. The Children's Network took on new importance. Children could move through the streets more easily than adults, attracting less attention from German patrols. They delivered the survival guides, moving information from library to library, from libraries to resistance cells, from resistance cells to desperate families. Sophie Backer, now 16 and gaunt from hunger, made over 40 courier runs that winter. She later described walking through Amsterdam's frozen streets with handwritten guides hidden in her coat, knowing that each delivery might help a family survive another week. I was so hungry I could barely walk straight, she recalled, but I had information in my pocket that someone needed. That kept me moving. The information was light. It didn't weigh anything, but it was the heaviest thing I ever carried because it represented hope.
The most legendary operation of the library resistance came in February 1945. Canadian forces were advancing from the south, American forces from the east. The liberation of the Netherlands was approaching, but German forces remained entrenched. The resistance needed detailed information on German defensive positions to coordinate with Allied advances and minimize civilian casualties. The request came to Anna Voss through a resistance courier. Detailed topographic maps of German positions in Noord-Holland, military installations, supply depots, troop concentrations, most urgent priority. The problem was obvious. Such maps would be impossible to disguise. Any German patrol finding them would immediately identify them as military intelligence. The courier carrying such materials would be shot on sight. Anna consulted with Grit Backer and Johann Decker. Together, they developed a plan that would become the most famous example of the library network's ingenuity. They would hide the maps inside children's storybooks, not as loose pages, but integrated into the books themselves. The maps would be drawn in a style that mimicked children's illustrations. Troop positions would become dragons. Supply depots would be treasure chests. Military installations would be castles. The topographic information would be preserved with perfect accuracy, but rendered as fantasy illustrations. It required an artist. They found one, Hendrika Riet Vermeer, a 23-year-old children's book illustrator whose husband had been executed by the Germans in 1943 for resistance activities. Riet had been quietly helping the library network for months, creating forged documents and false identification papers. Now, they asked her to create something unprecedented,
military intelligence disguised as children's fantasy. Riet worked for 6 days in the Amsterdam Library's back room, using real topographic maps from the library's geography collection as her source. She rendered each map as a colorful illustration showing a fantasy landscape. Roads became magical paths. Railways were dragon trails. German positions were marked with tiny castles and forts drawn with obsessive geographic accuracy. Each illustration was placed in an actual children's book from the library's collection. Old Dutch fairy tale books that were falling apart anyway, their pages loose, their bindings damaged. The maps were inserted seamlessly, looking for all the world like original illustrations that had always been there. The final products were 12 picture books, each containing multiple map illustrations. Together, they provided complete topographic and military intelligence for German positions across North Holland. The books were distributed through the Children's Network. Young couriers carried them openly through the streets. If stopped, they were just damaged books being taken to grandparents, to friends, to school. The illustrations looked like whimsical children's art. Only someone who knew what they were looking at would see the military intelligence hidden in the fantasy. The books reached their destination, resistance cells coordinating with Canadian forces. The maps were photographed and transmitted to Allied headquarters. When Canadian forces advanced into North Holland in April 1945, they used intelligence derived from children's fantasy illustrations drawn by a widow in a library back room. A Canadian military intelligence officer wrote in his after-action report, "The topographic intelligence provided by Dutch resistance sources was extraordinarily accurate. Key defensive positions were identified with precision. We encountered no surprises. The intelligence allowed us to plan approaches that minimized civilian casualties. Source unknown, but whoever produced these maps saved countless lives." The source was a children's book illustrator working by candlelight in a frozen library, and a network of librarians who understood that information could be hidden in plain sight if you made it look innocent enough.
March 27, 1945. The end was approaching. Allied forces were liberating the Netherlands, town by town. The German occupation was collapsing. But in its death throes, the regime grew more vicious. SS Hauptsturmführer Richter had spent 5 years hunting the library network. He knew it existed. He knew it was significant, but he had never been able to prove it, never caught them with enough evidence to prosecute. In March 1945, driven by fury at the impending German defeat, he decided that proof didn't matter anymore. He would arrest them anyway. His target was the Amsterdam Public Library and Griet Bakker. He had suspected her for years. Now he would act. The SD raid came at dawn. 30 agents surrounded the library. They found Griet at home, preparing to walk to work. She was arrested in front of her daughters, handcuffed and thrown into a truck. At SD headquarters, Richter confronted her with everything he suspected but couldn't prove. The hidden books, the underground newspapers, the intelligence packages, the children's network. "I know what you've been doing," he told her. "I've always known. I just couldn't prove it. But it doesn't matter anymore. The war is ending. Germany is losing. But before we leave, I'll make sure you hang." Griet looked at him calmly. "You're right about one thing. The war is ending, and history will judge what we did. You spent 5 years burning books and imprisoning ideas. We spent 5 years preserving knowledge
and distributing truth. History will remember which of us served humanity and which of us served tyranny. History is written by the victors. Then I'll be vindicated and you'll be condemned. Either way, we both know the truth. Richter ordered her taken to a cell. He planned to execute her within the week before Allied forces could arrive. But the library network had been preparing for this moment. Within hours of Griet's arrest, resistance members were activated across Amsterdam. The children's network went into emergency mode. Messages reached resistance cells with military connections. British and Canadian forces were informed that a key resistance figure was in imminent danger. A rescue operation was mounted, not a dramatic raid. That would have been impossible against SD headquarters, but something more sophisticated. A forged release order created by Riet Vermeer using techniques she'd learned over years of resistance work. The document, complete with perfect German stamps and signatures, ordered Griet's transfer to a facility in The Hague for special interrogation. The transfer never reached The Hague. Resistance fighters intercepted the transport vehicle, killed the guards, who were actually resistance sympathizers in stolen uniforms, and spirited Griet away to a safe house. She remained in hiding for 3 weeks until Canadian forces liberated Amsterdam on May 5, 1945. Richter, furious at being outwitted, ordered raids on every library in Amsterdam, but there was nothing to find. The moment Griet was arrested, the network had executed their emergency protocol. All hidden materials were moved to secure locations. All compromising records were destroyed. All couriers went dark. When German soldiers tore through the Amsterdam library, they found nothing but books on shelves and confused librarians who knew nothing about any resistance activities. Richter left the Netherlands on May 4th, one day before liberation, fleeing ahead of Allied forces. He would be captured in Germany in 1946, tried for war crimes, and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. His interrogation records show obsessive references to the library conspiracy and his failure to destroy it. "He beat me," he told interrogators. "A bunch of librarians and children beat me. I had the power of the Reich behind me, and they had books, and they won."
May 5th, 1945. Liberation. Canadian forces entered Amsterdam to scenes of jubilation. Dutch flags appeared from nowhere, the streets filled with dancing, crying, celebrating crowds. At the Amsterdam Public Library, Griet Bakker emerged from hiding and returned to her desk. Around her, staff members who had maintained deception for 5 years broke down in tears. They had survived. They had won. But the victory was bittersweet. The toll had been brutal. Of the original network of 43 librarians who participated in the resistance, 9 had been arrested. 3 were executed. 2 died in detention from torture and neglect. 4 survived imprisonment, but with permanent injuries. 6 librarians died during the hunger winter from starvation and related illnesses. Dozens more bore lasting health damage from 5 years of malnutrition and stress. Of the children's network, miraculously, only one had been captured, Piet van Houten, who had never revealed anything despite torture. He survived the war, but carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of his life. In 1947, at age 15, he was awarded the Dutch Cross of Resistance for his courage. The broader human cost was difficult to calculate.
family members of librarians had been arrested as leverage. Patrons who used the network had been imprisoned. People who had received information packages had been executed when caught with forbidden materials. But the positive impact was equally impossible to quantify. How many resistance operations succeeded because of library research? How many lives were saved during the Hunger Winter by survival guides? How many people maintained hope because they had access to truth instead of propaganda? The underground newspapers published special editions thanking the library network. Vrij Nederland's Liberation issue included a statement: "We could not have functioned without the research support provided by librarians who risked everything to ensure that truth had access to information. They were the invisible infrastructure of resistance, the keepers of knowledge in a time when ignorance was enforced by violence."
In the weeks after liberation, the libraries began revealing what they had hidden. The process was extraordinary. At Leiden, Anna Vos led Allied observers through the building, showing them the architecture of deception. False walls came down, revealing thousands of banned books. Floorboards were lifted, exposing hidden archives. The secret catalog emerged from storage. We preserved 11,847 banned volumes, Anna reported to the Dutch Provisional Government. We circulated approximately 6,000 different titles through resistance networks. We compiled over 2,800 research packages. We maintained records of everything. Those records, meticulously kept despite the danger, provided an incredible archive. Every banned book was cataloged. Every information request was documented. Every courier delivery was logged. The librarians had created a complete history of their own resistance. In Rotterdam, Johan Dekker revealed his scatter system. Allied intelligence officers spent 3 weeks working with library staff to identify and retrieve hidden materials. They found banned books shelved behind technical manuals in exactly the patterns Dekker had described. His circulation laundering system was so sophisticated that British intelligence asked permission to study it for future operations. The Hague Library revealed Saskia de Vries's forged authorization documents. The fake German paperwork was so convincing that it was initially believed to be authentic, until Saskia explained how she had created it. Allied document specialists called the forgeries among the finest we've encountered. But the most emotional revelation came at Utrecht, where the wine cellar library was opened for the first time since liberation. Professors and students who had attended the secret seminars gathered to witness it. They descended through the janitor's closet into the candlelit vault one last time. 5,000 banned books lined the walls, preserved perfectly, despite 5 years of occupation. In the center of the room, someone had carved into the wooden table: "Hier heeft de waarheid geleefd." Here, truth lived. Professor Ernst van Dijk, who had attended seminars throughout the war, wept openly. This room kept us sane, knowing that somewhere beneath German boots, democracy was still being discussed, freedom was still being debated, knowledge was still being shared. This room proved that ideas cannot be imprisoned.
The Dutch government struggled with how to recognize the library network's contributions. They had operated largely in secret. They had broken laws, even though those laws were German impositions. They had used children as couriers, which raised ethical questions despite the careful consent process. In September 1945, a special ceremony was held at the Royal Palace in Amsterdam. Queen Wilhelmina, returned from exile, personally honored the library resistance. "You preserved our culture," the Queen said. "When the Germans tried to control what Dutch citizens could know, could read, could think, you ensured that knowledge remained free. You transformed libraries from buildings that held books into fortresses that defended ideas. You proved that civilians with no weapons except knowledge could resist tyranny effectively." Griet Bakker, Anna Voss, Johan Dekker, and 15 other librarians received the Dutch Cross of Resistance. An additional 32 library staff members received commendations. The Children's Network members received special recognition, with Piet van Houten invited to stand beside the Queen during the ceremony. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. In October 1945, Jewish survivors returning from concentration camps learned about the library network's efforts to preserve Jewish literature. While synagogues had been destroyed and Jewish libraries burned, the Dutch public librarians had hidden Jewish authors, preserved Hebrew texts, and maintained access to centuries of Jewish scholarship. Chief Rabbi Justus Talva sought out the librarians personally. "You saved our books when you couldn't save our people," he told them, tears streaming down his face. "You preserved our words when our voices were being silenced. You kept our culture alive when we were being murdered. This gift is beyond measure." The surviving Jewish texts from the library collections were donated to the rebuilt Jewish community. They formed the core of new libraries and archives, ensuring that Dutch Jewish scholarship survived the Holocaust.
In 1947, the Dutch government commissioned a study of library resistance activities. The report, compiled over 18 months, revealed the full scope of what had been accomplished. The library network had preserved 47,342 banned books across 23 libraries, circulated over 18,000 forbidden texts through resistance networks, compiled 2,847 intelligence packages for resistance operations, distributed survival information that reached an estimated 200,000 civilians during the hunger winter, maintained historical archives that documented German occupation policies, created forged documents that helped over 400 people escape arrest, trained and coordinated 87 child couriers who made over 5,000 successful deliveries. But beyond the numbers, the report identified key lessons about institutional resistance under totalitarian control. First, resistance need not be violent to be effective. The librarians destroyed no bridges, killed no soldiers, sabotaged no trains, yet they significantly impacted German control by maintaining access to information. Second, the most effective resistance uses existing institutional structures. The libraries were already established, trusted, understood. They didn't create new organizations that would attract suspicion. They subverted existing ones. Third, preparation and training matter. The librarian's professional expertise in cataloging, organization, and information management translated directly into resistance skills. They knew how to hide things, track things, and move things efficiently because those were their professional competencies. Fourth, networks of trust are more secure than hierarchical organizations. The library system had no single leader to arrest, no central command to destroy. Each library operated semi-independently while coordinating through personal relationships built over years. Fifth, moral clarity sustains resistance during hardship. The librarians never wavered in their belief that knowledge should be free, that ideas cannot be legitimately controlled by force, that preservation of truth matters more than personal safety. This conviction sustained them through 5 years of danger, hunger, and fear. The report became required reading for resistance movements worldwide during the Cold War. When totalitarian regimes took power, librarians would often be among the first to organize quiet resistance using techniques pioneered in the Netherlands. The librarians returned to their profession, but they were changed. The experience of 5 years as resistance fighters had transformed their understanding of what libraries were for. Greet Bakker became director of the Amsterdam Public Library System. Under her leadership, it became one of Europe's most progressive library systems, emphasizing open access, intellectual freedom, and resistance to censorship in any form. When the Dutch government proposed removing controversial political materials during Cold War tensions, Greet publicly refused. "I spent 5 years fighting censorship," she said. "I won't accept it now just because the censors wear different uniforms." Anna Vos was appointed to Leiden University's Library Science Department. She developed courses on information ethics, library resistance to authoritarianism, and the role of libraries in preserving cultural heritage during conflict. Her textbook, Libraries Under Tyranny: Professional Ethics in Impossible Circumstances, became standard reading for library students worldwide. Johan Dekker remained at Rotterdam, rebuilding the library that had been damaged by bombing. He implemented systems to ensure that the library could never be weaponized against patrons. Circulation records were deliberately kept minimal and destroyed after a set period. Anonymous access was emphasized. Privacy protection became a core value. "The Germans taught us that library records can be used to hunt people," Dekker explained. "Circulation records showing who read what books became death sentences. I'll never maintain detailed records again. Patron privacy isn't just a courtesy, it's a life or death necessity." Saskia de Vries became an advocate for document security and forgery prevention, ironically advising governments on how to create unforgeable documents by using her own wartime expertise. She also consulted with newly liberated countries on how to identify and remove forged documentation left behind by fleeing Nazi officials. The children of the Courier network carried their experiences throughout their lives. Many became educators, journalists, and activists, their childhood resistance informing their life's work. Sophie Bakker became a children's author and illustrator, working closely with Riet Vermeer, the woman who had created the fantasy map books. Together, they produced a series of children's books about courage, resistance, and the power of knowledge. The books never explicitly mentioned the war, but the themes were clear to those who knew their story. Piet van Houten, the boy who had been tortured by the SD and never broke, became a psychologist specializing in trauma. He spent his career helping survivors of persecution and abuse, using his own experience to provide hope. "If a 10-year-old can resist the Gestapo," he told his patients, "you can survive your trauma too."
The story of the library resistance was largely unknown for decades. The librarians didn't publicize their wartime activities. They returned to their profession quietly, maintaining the same principle that had guided their resistance. Knowledge should be freely accessible, and those who facilitate access should remain invisible. But in the 1970s, as the generation that had lived through the occupation grew older, there was a push to document resistance activities before memories faded. Oral history projects interviewed survivors. Archives were opened. The hidden history emerged. In 1978, the Dutch Resistance Museum opened an exhibition on cultural resistance, the Library Network. It displayed the hidden wine cellar from Utrecht, reconstructed in the museum, the secret catalog from The Hague, examples of the disguised books from Amsterdam, and most powerfully, the children's fantasy map books from the final months of the war. The exhibition attracted international attention. Librarians from around the world visited to study the techniques. The American Library Association created an award named after Anna Voss, the librarians who defend intellectual freedom under pressure. In 1982, Griet Bakker was invited to speak at the International Federation of Library Associations conference in Montreal. She was 90 years old, her hands shaking with palsy, but her voice was strong. We did what librarians have always done. We connected people with information. The fact that doing so became an act of resistance says something about the regime we faced, not about us. In a free society, librarians are unremarkable public servants. Under tyranny, the same actions become revolutionary. We didn't change, the context changed. But this reveals a truth about libraries. They are inherently democratic institutions. They assume that information should be freely available, that people can think for themselves, that knowledge doesn't need to be controlled, that truth doesn't fear examination. These assumptions are incompatible with authoritarianism, so libraries will always be among the first targets when democracy fails. And librarians must always be prepared to resist, not with guns, but with the same tools we use in peacetime: organization, information, knowledge, and an unwavering commitment to the idea that people have the right to know. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes. Librarians from countries still under authoritarian control wept openly, recognizing their own struggles in Griet's words.
In April 1945, 50 years after liberation, the surviving members of the library resistance held a reunion. Only 11 were still alive. Griet had died in 1989, Johan Decker in 1992, but Anna Voss, now 96, attended, along with several children from the Courier Network, now themselves senior citizens. They met at the Amsterdam Public Library, in the same reading room where the resistance had begun 55 years earlier. The library had created a small permanent exhibition about their activities, tucked away in a corner of the building. It showed photos, documents, and artifacts from the occupation years. The survivors walked through the exhibition together, pointing at photos and sharing memories. Sophie Bakker,
now 66 and a grandmother, stood before a display showing one of the fantasy map books she had carried as a courier. "I remember delivering this one," she said softly. "March 1945. I was so hungry I could barely walk. German soldiers stopped me twice. I showed them the pictures and said I was taking it to my grandmother, who loved fairy tales. They let me pass. I didn't know then that Canadian soldiers would use these maps to liberate my city. I thought I was just carrying a book." Anna Voss, leaning heavily on a cane, smiled. "That's the beauty of it. You were just carrying a book. That's all any of us ever did. We just made sure that books got to the people who needed them. The fact that those books contained forbidden knowledge, military intelligence, survival information, proof that resistance was possible, that just made them more important to deliver." "Do you think people understand?" asked Willem Johnson, son of the late Peter Johnson. "Does anyone today realize how radical it was what you did? How much courage it took to lend a book?" Anna was quiet for a moment. "Probably not. In peacetime, libraries seem so ordinary, quiet buildings with dusty books. But that ordinariness is precious. It means democracy is functioning. It means information is freely available. It means knowledge doesn't need to be hidden. The day people understand what we did is the day they've lost what we fought for. I hope future generations never truly comprehend the courage it required to lend a book. Because if they understand, it means they're living under the same tyranny we faced." She paused, then smiled. "But they'll have the stories. They'll know it's possible to resist. They'll know that librarians can be warriors and books can be weapons. If democracy ever fails again, they'll remember that a bunch of Dutch librarians with no guns and no army beat the Third Reich, armed only with knowledge. That memory might inspire someone when they need it."
The Amsterdam Library exhibition still exists today. It's been expanded several times, most recently in 2015. The fantasy map books are displayed under glass, their colorful illustrations showing castles and dragons that were really troop positions and supply depots. Children visiting the library press their faces against the glass, enchanted by the pictures, not understanding what they're really looking at. Their parents do, and they understand the lesson. Information disguised as innocence can still be truth. Knowledge hidden in plain sight is still knowledge. And ordinary people doing ordinary jobs can become heroes when they refuse to surrender their principles. The Wine Cellar Library at Utrecht University has been preserved exactly as it was. Students can visit by appointment. They descend through the same janitor's closet into the same candlelit vault and sit at the same table where "Here Truth Lived" is carved into the wood. Many students cry when they visit. They understand they're sitting where democracy survived underground while tyranny marched overhead. They're touching the books that people risked death to preserve. They're breathing the air of resistance. The Dutch library schools require all students to study the library resistance. They read the techniques, examine the methods, discuss the ethics. The question is always asked, would you do the same? Most students say yes, but they understand it's easier to say in a free country, in a safe classroom, without Gestapo agents at the door. The hope is they never have to prove it. The fear is that someday, somewhere, they might.
In 2003, a letter was discovered in the archives of the Amsterdam Public Library.
It had been written by Greet Bakker in 1989, shortly before her death, with instructions that it be opened on the 60th anniversary of the Library Resistance's formation in 1940. The letter was read publicly in May 2000 at a ceremony honoring the Library Resistance. Greet's granddaughter, herself a librarian, read it aloud. To the librarians of the future, I am writing this in 1989, nearly half a century after the events you may have heard about. I am old now, and my memories of the war years are both crystal clear and somehow distant, as if they happened to someone else. I want you to know something important. We were not heroes. We were librarians doing our jobs under impossible circumstances. We believed that connecting people with information was our professional responsibility. The fact that the government of occupation declared this illegal didn't change our responsibility. It just made it dangerous. You live in a free society where lending books is unremarkable. Treasure that, protect it, because freedom of information is fragile. It can be lost faster than you imagine. If you're reading this because freedom is again under threat, because books are again being banned, because knowledge is again being controlled, then remember our story and take courage. We had no special training, no weapons, no resources except the books we'd sworn to protect and the courage to do our jobs despite the risks. You have the same tools we had. Use them. Hide what must be hidden. Circulate what must be circulated. Create the systems and networks that preserve knowledge when tyranny demands ignorance. And remember, the books are never just books. They're ideas, possibilities, hope, proof that the human mind cannot be chained. Every book you preserve is an act of defiance. Every book you lend is a blow against tyranny. Every patron you serve is a victory for freedom. We won not because we were strong, but because we refused to surrender. The Third Reich had armies, weapons, power. We had books. In the end, the books outlasted the Reich. Be brave, be stubborn, be librarians, and never ever forget that knowledge is freedom, and freedom is worth any risk. With love and respect, Greet Bakker, former librarian and forever defender of the written word. The letter ended. The ceremony attendees sat in silence. Then someone started clapping. It spread until the entire auditorium was applauding a 99-year-old letter from a dead woman who had once defied an empire armed only with books and stubborn courage. The applause continued for 5 minutes, and in that applause was recognition, gratitude, and a promise. If the darkness ever returns, there will be librarians ready to hide the books, preserve the truth, and prove again that knowledge cannot be conquered.